Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for us to be here with you today, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you today to launch this speaker series, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Learning, organized in collaboration with the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, CSLP, Concordia, and McGill University. My name is Jehan Rabah, manager of the CSLP. I would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on indigenous lands. Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. I'll start with a little. Do you know about the CSLP? So maybe I'll start with a little bit of an introduction on the CSLP. The mission of the CSLP at Concordia University is to research teaching and learning processes. We currently have about 45 faculty members and various undergraduate and graduate student members who have developed unique pedagogical expertise working with community organizations, school boards, policymaking bodies, and social health service providers. Our center's overall focus is to develop evidence-based tools and strategies that would positively impact our society. One of the center's development priorities is to support the transfer of knowledge to practice settings. For us, this speaker series is one way we are hoping to achieve this objective and reach out to several educators, public policy reps, school counselors, psychosocial experts, researchers, and administrators of educational institutions. So welcome to all of you. Our presenter today, whom our esteemed Professor McDonough will introduce in a few minutes, will have 45 minutes for his presentation. A period of questions and answers will follow. Kindly write your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom towards the bottom of your Zoom screen. And please indicate if you would like to be called upon to ask your question directly to Dr. Weinstock, or otherwise we will be happy to ask it on your behalf. We will try to handle as much as possible, hopefully all of your questions. The question period will begin as soon as our speaker is done with the presentation, around, let's say, 4:15 p.m. Please kindly note that we will be recording and that we are recording the presentation today. The conference recording will be available on the center's website and social media pages in the coming weeks. It gives me great pleasure to give the floor now to Professor McDonough to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jehan, and thank you to everyone for being here for the talk today. I first met Daniel Weinstock about 21 and a half years ago. I was just realizing at a conference that I organized here in Montreal on the topic of citizenship and education in cosmopolitan societies. And over the years, we've continued to discuss our interest in philosophy of education. I've always valued Daniel's sharp insights on education, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce him today. So very briefly, for those of you who don't know Professor Weinstock, he's currently full professor and Catherine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy in the faculties of Law and of Arts at McGill University. Until recently, he was director of the McGill Institute for Health and Social Policy. He's formerly professor of philosophy and a Canada Research Chair in Ethics and Political Philosophy at the University of Montreal. And Professor Weinstock's research interests cover a wide range of topics in contemporary moral and political philosophy, from the just management of ethnocultural and religious diversity in liberal societies to state policy with respect to children, families, and educational institutions. His main research interests at present have to do with the problem of health, equity, and with issues of justice and inclusion as they arise in the organization of modern cities. The guiding thread of his research has been to connect philosophical and ethical arguments with institutional reasoning. It's marked by the firm conviction that modern moral and political philosophers have traditionally paid insufficient attention to the institutional parameters that both enable and constrain the realization of normative ideals. His areas of expertise also include politics of language, identity, democracy, citizenship, and pluralism. He's also one of Quebec's foremost public intellectuals, and in that respect, he's been an active participant in public policy in Quebec, having been a member from 1997 to 1999 of a Ministry of Education working group on religion in public schools. And from 2003 to 2008, he was the founding director of Quebec's Public Health Ethics Community, or Ethics Committee, I should say. And it's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Daniel, who will talk to us about his paper, Providing Options, a Minimalist Theory of Personal Autonomy and Its Educational Implications. Daniel.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. I'm just going to take a pause to look at Kevin to make sure that he's giving me the thumbs up and that I'm audible. And can everybody hear me?
I can hear you, Daniel.
Okay, so I'm just going to assume that everything is fine technically. It is a bit still of a disembodied, strange experience to be speaking into a screen without being able to see anybody's faces, but I'm just going to assume that unless I hear otherwise, everything is going fine. So I'd like to thank, great, I'd like to thank Kevin and the organizers of this seminar series for the opportunity to try out an idea, an argument, which is going to be part of a larger project, which I'm working on now and which I hope to finish this summer. And the project is this. So I am writing a book with my colleague, Victor Muniz Fraticelli, from the law faculty and the Department of Political Science at McGill. And it's one of these Oxford University Press for and against books where two authors get about 100 pages to develop a position on an issue about which they disagree, and then get another 20 or 30 pages to respond to one another. The subject about which Victor and I disagree is about whether, religious schools, whether the state should, whether there should be religious schools in a liberal democratic society. I'm taking the no side, and Victor is taking the yes side. The originality of my argument is that I am couching it in what is referred to in some of the recent literature as a dual interest theory of the family and of relations between parents and children. What do I mean by that? Well, there is a view about the relationship of parents and children, which is the single interest view, that says that the only interests that count morally, politically, in figuring out how parents should parent their children, and generally how the institutions of upbringing of children should be organized, the only interests that should count are that of children. Everybody, parents, schools, etc., play a fiduciary role relative to children, and there are no, in particular, irreducible interests that parents have that might create tensions or conflicts or difficulties in reconciling different sets of interests. So when you have a single interest view of childhood, well, you know, the argument that you should just have whatever schools are best for children, regardless of what parents want, regardless of whether parents want schools that extend, as it were, the familial realm into schools, well, that's a fairly easy argument to make, because on a single interest view, parents' interests don't weigh in the balance. My view is different. My view is that we should count that parents do have interests that should be taken into account in thinking about the arrangement of institutions that contribute to the upbringing of children. In particular, they have a limited, circumscribed right to shape their children's upbringing according to their passions, their beliefs, their parenting styles, their religious views, or indeed non-religious views. And the role of schools, according to this view, is to ensure that the interests of children are also institutionally secured within the overall institutional setup within which children are raised. So the basic idea behind my part of the project is that there's a kind of a division of moral labor that occurs between the different institutions that contribute to the education and the upbringing of children. On the one hand, you have parents whose interests in shaping their children's worldviews and values provide them with a limited right to do so within the context of the home and the family. And on the other hand, children have an interest in an education which prepares them for later life in all sorts of ways. And we can be more confident in providing parents with this limited right to shape the views of their children in the home when we have a school system that is detached from the parental view, that is not simply an extension of the home into the school, into the area of schools. We can be confident that both sets of interests, and in particular, the interests of children, will be realized institutionally when we have this division of labor working between children and children and their parents. So in other words, it's easier to justify the shaping activity carried out by parents if we know that that shaping is being balanced, as it were, or offset, or placed in a context in which greater diversity is provided by the education that children receive in schools. And so schools should not simply extend the parental domain. But this just opens up a space for the idea that schools should be doing something different, something detached from what parents are doing at home. But what positively should the schools do? So a widely held view is that schools should promote the liberty of children to access a wide range of different life courses. The assumption here is that parents will be quite naturally, will have a quite natural tendency to try to imprint and impress upon children the values that they hold dearest, the ways of life that they privilege, perhaps the way of life that they have themselves led, the way of life that they aspire to for their children, perhaps religious views, although it's important to note that the argument is not restricted to the role that religious parents might have in their children's upbringing. The assumption is that the home is, in a way, the realm of particularity, the area in which parents almost necessarily will act in ways that will tend to steer children to a greater degree than would otherwise be the case towards a very particular set of values, activities, career choices, spiritual outlooks, those that the parents have chosen to imprint upon the life of the family. So we think that this is a good thing. Part of what being an agent means is to be able to live according to a set of values, live according to a particular religious doctrine, a particular conception of the good. And so parents contribute one element to the recipe that needs to be put in place in order for children to become agents. But they should also possess the ability to choose a path of life different from that for which their parents have shaped them. And this is where schools perform an important role. They ideally broaden out the perspective that children have and that they will develop as adults in a way which provides a counterpoint, a counterbalance, a broader context within which to consider the sort of proposals made to them by their parents in terms of either values or career choices or what have you. Now, this role, which I have couched in extremely general terms for the time being, the idea that schools should promote the liberty of children to access a wide range of different life courses, has been understood in a couple of manners in the literature, in the philosophical literature that I converse with. And basically what I want to do in this talk is to suggest to you that one of them has been dominant in recent years, but that it has perhaps led the discussion of these issues, the discussion of the particular role that schools should perform in broadening the range within which children and later adults make decisions as to the kinds of life that they will lead, the dominant view has perhaps led us astray, and that we should perhaps be thinking along the lines proposed by the other view, the less dominant view, which I will describe right now. So there's a famous essay that was published in 1980 by a philosopher of law by the name of Joel Feinberg, called The Child's Right to an Open Future. Now, it's probably one of the most widely read, widely cited, and widely misunderstood articles in all of this philosophical literature. I sometimes get the feeling that people don't get beyond just looking at the title, and it seems to put forward a kind of, at the limit, absurd view, namely that there should be no limits on the options that are available to children as they make their way through life, which sounds like an idea which is just unrealizable, a kind of a pipe dream. But what I want to focus on is that Feinberg's article invites us to focus on what I would call the external perspectives on the, call it, autonomy of children. What is the environment, Feinberg is asking us, within which children are best made able to make their own path through life? So another view, which is, I think, dominant now, and it can be found in the writings of a wide range of authors who have devoted their attention to the role of schools, to the goals that schools should perform in the lives of their pupils. I have just three examples on the slide here. Eamon Callan, in his 1997 book, Creating Citizens; Mira Levinson, in her 1999 book, can I reach down and look at the title? I forgot what the title is. Anyway, Myra Levinson in a 1999 book, which I've forgotten the title of. Harry Brighouse in his 2000 book.
The Ends of Liberal Education.
The Ends of Liberal Education. Thank you very much, Kevin. It's good to have somebody whispering my lines to me from the sidelines. Harry Brighouse in his 2000 book on education. The idea there is that the role of schools should be in this neighborhood, in the neighborhood of promoting the liberty of children to access a wide range of different life courses, should be to promote the autonomy of children. Now, those might sound like the same thing, right? The child's right to an open future, have as many options open to you. Promoting autonomy sounds like that ideal is well served by having as many options open to you in the future. And yet I want to note a difference of focus, which seems to me to be present in these two options. The former, so the view that I've identified with Joel Feinberg's article, looks outwards towards the range of options available to children and to the adults that they will become, and that children have a right here and now to an education that will leave options open to them. So again, Feinberg's article does not claim that a child's options should be maximally open. He recognizes fully that in particular, the culture that a child is raised in, the parents that raise him, set some constraints on the range of options that can be open to a child. So the idea is not that options should be maximally open, but they should be sufficiently open, that children are able to exercise a sufficient choice over a range of options that provides them with, I'm going to use the word sufficient again, a sufficient range of options rather than a maximal set of options. But again, here the focus is outward. We look at the options that are made available to children and try to determine whether they're adequate or not. The latter, the view that I've identified with the promotion of autonomy, tends to emphasize the inward quality of the cognitive and perhaps even affective mechanisms through which choices are made. To use a distinction that is famous from the writings of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. There are autonomous and heteronymous ways in which to make choices. Autonomous choices are ones that one makes according to one's own lights, according to one's own values, from the inside, as it were, to use a sort of spatial metaphor that comes up again and again in this literature. Heteronymous decision-making, heteronymous choice, is choice that is made under the influence of external forces, perhaps the influence of family, of culture, of parents, but also perhaps certain internal forces with which one doesn't necessarily identify. Simple desires, passing fancies, passions, perhaps even neuroses of various kinds, right? So the idea of autonomy is not just that one makes a choice, but that one makes a choice in a certain way. Now, I would argue that the autonomy option has become dominant in the recent literature, both amongst defenders of the detached school, and there's a bit of a sentence missing there, amongst their opponents. Defenders of the detached school view autonomy, as I've just described it, as a worthwhile goal to pursue through pedagogy and other aspects of the organization of schools. And detractors will tend to say, look, autonomy is an inappropriate ideal because it is inappropriately partial in a society in which people sometimes view the question of one's relationship to, for example, to tradition in quite different ways. To insist upon autonomy is viewed by detractors of a kind of detached school that places autonomy at its heart as an inappropriate goal. So my position is that the focus on autonomy understood in this way has made the argument for the detached school vulnerable to a number of criticisms that have been leveled at it by opponents, some of which I have just quickly laid out. And my intention is to try to redirect the defense of the detached school towards a view that looks outwards, towards the environment within which choices are made, rather than inward toward the specific ways in which agents engage in the act of choosing. So to put that in slightly less slightly less bookish manner, worry less about the exact cognitive, affective, psychological mechanisms through which people, children, adolescents, the adults that they become, make choices, and more about the environment within which they make those choices, more with the type of question towards which Feinberg geared us, namely the question of whether adequate choices are available, adequate options are available to children or not, and whether those options are actually really accessible to them, or whether they're just formal theoretical options. So again, to summarize what I take my main argument, the position that I want to put forward in terms of a slogan, the role of school should be to enable children to access options. And we're going to spend a little bit of time later on thinking about the conditions that need to be in place for both those words to obtain in the situation of a particular school or a particular child. What does it mean for him or her to have options? And perhaps more importantly, what needs to be in place in order for him or her to have actual access to them, for them to be real options for him or her. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time now telling you about why I think that the view that I claim is dominant within this literature has led us down the wrong path, a path that does disservice to the argument, or that perhaps raises complexities that needn't be raised for the defense of the detached or the common school, the kind of school that I am arguing for in this book, namely one that does not merely constitute a kind of continuation of the family domain into the public area of the school. So I want to introduce you to, so I should preface this by saying that all of this debate is occurring within the terms of what is broadly understood as being liberal theory, namely a theory that claims that the main role of public institutions and of coercive laws should be to promote the rights and the well-being of individuals. And that at the end of the day, to use a turn of phrase that was made famous by probably the most famous liberal political philosopher of the 20th century, John Rawls, that only individuals are self-authenticating originators of moral claims. We should always be judging our institutions, our schools, our other coercive institutions by the metric of how they do by individuals' well-being and by the individuals' rights. So within the broad family of liberal theories, one way of distinguishing amongst them is in the following manner. There are, on the one hand, people who are sometimes referred to as autonomy liberals. These are people who believe that people should choose autonomous lifestyles. They should be wary of tradition. They should be striking out in bold new directions. They should not view their futures as in any way determined by their pasts or by the pasts of their families or communities. Autonomy is a kind of a substantive ideal of a life lived with oneself as its author, as it were, as opposed to someone who accepts the authorship of one's life by other forces, by other people, be they one's parents, one's community, one's tradition. To be distinguished from pluralist liberals, or sometimes referred to as toleration liberals, who say that a liberal society is one that shouldn't really be too concerned about the content of the lifestyles, the content of the choices that people make for their lives. What they should worry about is simply the ways in which they make these decisions. So the two note the distinction, which may be subtle but important, between the ways in which I've characterized the two approaches. On the one hand, the idea that people should choose autonomous lifestyles. To go back to what I said a moment ago, they should live lives that are of which they are the authors, as it were, versus the idea that people should choose their lifestyles autonomously. And the idea there is that it doesn't matter what the content or what the origin of the ideas on the basis of which one builds one life is, so long as one chooses this lifestyle in a manner which is not constrained or coerced by others. In other words, one could choose, according to a pluralist liberal view, to live a very traditional life, to live a life the contours of which are quite rigidly determined, say, by a religious tradition, as long as one does so through one's own choice, rather than through coercion. So another way of marking the distinction between these two is to say that one is substantive. It points to a certain ideal, a substantive ideal of what a good life is, whereas the other one is more procedural. It points to the kinds of cognitive procedures that one should be employing in order to choose one's life path, accepting fully that one's life path could be one of conformity with tradition or with roles that have been determined for one from outside. So in the literature, in the debates that I'm interested in philosophy of education, the The move from autonomy liberalism, which is the liberalism that one finds in the classic formulations of philosophers of the 18th to 19th century, like Immanuel Kant or John Stuart Mill, the move from autonomy liberalism to a more pluralist liberalism, one that accepts a wide range of different kinds of lifestyles, including very traditional ones, on condition that they be chosen in an autonomous way, is thought by pluralist liberals to counter the charge that has been made against autonomy liberals of being perfectionist in a way that is illicit. Now, let me explain what that means. One of the main claims of liberal theory, of course, is that governments should treat all individuals that fall under their authority as equals. Now, one of the implications for a lot of liberals of that obvious intuitive requirement, treating everybody as equals, is that liberal government should be neutral as between different ways of conceiving what the good life is, right? It shouldn't have an official government theory about what the good life for people is, because if it did that, it would violate the requirement of equality. It would say that some people, those who live according to the dictates of the privileged way of life, are, as it were, better than the people who choose otherwise. And so a requirement that many liberals have seen as imperative for the state is that the state should be rigorously neutral as between different ways of thinking of the good life, lest it violate its fundamental commitment to the equality of all individuals. And autonomy liberalism would fall foul of this stricture, according to this criticism, because it says that certain contents, certain ways, substantive ways of thinking of the good life are better than others. Pluralist liberals respond to that by saying, no, no, no. One can give an important place to autonomy, right? Not because one privileges the life of the maverick, but simply because one thinks that one's ways of life should not be imposed. So pluralist liberalism imposes no strictures, no limits on the content of choices. It simply says, again, a fundamental commitment of liberalism is the requirement of consent and individual liberty. It simply says that autonomy is an implication of the requirement of consent and liberty. No one should live a life to which they have not consented, and therefore no one should lead a life that they have not somehow endorsed. Sounds very plausible. So it's a procedural rather than a substantive conception of autonomy, and according to pluralist liberals, it should pass the test of neutrality and of treating everybody as equals. Indeed, the claim is that everybody has the right to a life that has been chosen by them. So doesn't violate the egalitarian requirement. Okay. So what does procedural autonomy consist in? I've just put up on this slide a number of quotes drawn from some of the authors who have written on autonomy, and in particular on autonomy in education. And what I want to show is that the requirements are actually quite, demanding is the wrong word, but they are ones that you can imagine good lives being led without instantiating these particular elements of the procedural conception of autonomy. One of the problems with writing papers and doing anything really in the context of the pandemic is that my library, my main source of books is at the office. I think I've been at in my office twice or three times since the pandemic began. And so some of the books that I needed to chase down quotes, I didn't have to hand, but here are some that I did. So this is from Myra Levinson's book, which was mentioned a moment ago. So she talks of autonomy as higher order preference formation within a context of cultural coherence, plural constitutive personal values and beliefs, openness to others' evaluations of oneself, and a sufficiently developed moral, spiritual, or aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional personality. So I want to draw your attention to the first few words there, higher order preference formation. This is from Matthew Clayton, who's another author who's been very influential in this literature. An autonomous life is one in which the individual concerned identifies with or endorses the ideals or goals that guide her conduct. Harry Brighouse, they have to live the life that they are leading from the inside. They must at the very least not experience their ways of life as being at odds with their most fundamental experienced interests and desires. And here is where I have had trouble locating quotes because I didn't have the books before me, but you'll find a broad swath of authors writing in this area, picking up a formulation of what autonomy requires that is due to ultimately Rawls, but perhaps made most famous by a Canadian philosopher by the name of Will Kymlicka, which says that autonomy, the kind of autonomy that people should pursue, and that the state and educational institutions should help people to pursue, is one in which we can conceive, pursue, and if necessary, revise our own conception of the good. I can locate the exact passages and we'll have to locate the exact passages in which this idea is put forward in further versions of this presentation. So all this sounds great, and none of what I am claiming denies that this is an attractive ideal that might be pursued by some, but it does embody a certain number of strictures on what counts as procedural autonomy, which are probably worth highlighting. So as a background, I think that a lot of these views have been influenced by a conception of autonomy and indeed of human agency that was developed and made famous and very compelling by a number of authors writing in the 70s. One of them is Gerald Dworkin. The other one is Harry Frankfurt, which basically sees human agency as being a kind of a two-level affair, right? We have agency built around, on the one hand, desires, intentions, first order sort of cognitive and emotional sort of states, which lead us to wanting to do one thing rather than another, to having one thing rather than another. So we have first order states that lead us to wanting to act in certain ways rather than others. But autonomy consists in those first order states, those first order desires, wishes, intentions, being in conformity with one's second order desires or one's second order intentions. What is a second order desire or second order intention? Well, it's a desire or an intention that has first order desires and intentions as their objects. Take a very simple example. I want that piece of chocolate cake over there, first order desire, but I want not to want it because perhaps I have formed the second order intention of going on a diet or whatever. And autonomy consists in a conformity of first to second order desires. When I am able to constrain my first order desires on the basis of my second order desires, when what I want and what I want to want are in sort of sync, then I am an autonomous agent. And when I'm not, it means that my first order desires are sort of dragging me around by the scruff of the neck. And that is a violation of the requirement of autonomy. So I think that that view has been very influential in forming the views of autonomy that we find in some of the quotes and others that I could have put up by educational theorists like Levinson, Clayton, and Brighouse. Why is my slide not moving forward? Okay, so there are a certain number of things which are central to this picture. One is that an autonomous person is in some ways reflective, right? He or she is able to take a kind of cognitive step back relative to her current desires and either endorse them or not endorse them. When the spatial image that I talked about a moment ago of an autonomous life being one that is led from the inside, when that idea is mentioned, well, what it's referring to is the idea that I am able to, as it were, view my current desires from the perspective of these articulated second order desires and either endorse them or not. Clearly, there's a kind of a requirement of articulacy that is present as well. This activity can only really occur if I have articulated my second order desires to some degree. And there is a requirement of coherence, very strong coherence, which is both vertical and horizontal. What do I mean by vertical coherence? Well, there's a coherence between my second order desires and my first order volitions. But there's also coherence amongst my second order desires. Indeed, if I have all kinds of different values that structure my second order desires, then I won't be able to do the work of evaluating my first order desires with respect to them because I need to have some coherent set of values in order to be able to carry out evaluation. Okay, so that's a very demanding, attractive, at least some would find it attractive, vision of agency towards which one might want to aspire. Just take a moment to find my way myself amongst my own notes here. So I'd like to introduce you in order to start seeing what I view the problem with articulating the educational goal of sort of freeing children from the hold that parental objectives may have on them in terms of autonomy so construed. I'd like to introduce you to a number of characters who I think are perhaps familiar amongst us, and a few of them I will introduce by quoting writers and philosophers. So the first that I draw from an essay from Charles Larmor, a philosopher from 1999, I will refer to as the Proustian from À la recherche du temps perdu, Marcel Proust. Well, because Charles Larmor does himself. So here's what he says. The idea that life should be the object of a plan is false to the human condition. It misses the important truth which Proust, by contrast, discerned and made into one of the organizing themes of his great meditation on disappointment and revelation, à la recherche du temps perdu. The happiness that life affords is less often the good we have reason to pursue than the good that befalls us unexpectedly. So here the idea is that part of what being an agent involves, or for some people, one of the ways in which people's life choices may come to them is by chance rather than by choice, rolling with the punches, as it were, and making the best or not making the best of the opportunities that adventitiously fall in our path might be another sort of picture of human agency that we might want to consider, and that indeed, if Larmor is right about Proust, that Proust instantiates in the protagonist of his great work. So I've labeled the second of the figures that I want to introduce you to as the Whitmanian. Well-known passage from Song of Myself 51. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. I pick out this quote from this well-known poem as a way of indicating that coherence of the kind which is central, I think, to the autonomy picture is itself a value, and indeed one that may be contested in the lives of some people whose lives are nonetheless ones that we want to say can go very well. Life needn't be about picking a path devising a plan of life and sticking to it throughout, life may be about negotiating the tensions and contradictions that one's diverse and sometimes perhaps even contradictory commitments and values puts before one. Now, from an essay by Owen Flanagan, a philosopher as well, who was critiquing the view that I briefly described to you, the Frankfurt and Dworkin view, as being one that puts forward an ideal of articulacy that needn't be embodied in good human lives. So this is a quote from one of his essays. Furthermore, and he's talking about Tolstoy here, his noble peasants typically express a humble comprehension of their role in carrying out certain communal projects, whose origins are antecedent to their own births and that will continue long after they die. But it is not clear that their intersubjectivity is very reflectively held, or that it is subject to articulate containment by them in the form of some abstract philosophical truth. Again, the idea is that lives can go well, even if they are not articulate in the manner that seems to be required by the view that I described a moment ago. Other ways in which lives can go well and choices made that don't embody the kind of procedure that seems to be laid out by autonomy, by the autonomy ideal. Epiphanies. All of a sudden, like Saul on the road to Damascus, one sees as if by a kind of without necessary reflection, but by some option imposing itself upon one in a way which resonates through one's entire being, one can cast out on a new path because one has, as it were, appreciated it in a sort of non-reflected and non-deliberative way, perhaps through some kind of an aesthetic or spiritual revelation. And finally, I want to put forward another figure, that of the person realizing their childhood dreams. Now, I don't know whether this is the case for the people who are out there, but I know a couple of people who were childhood friends who had never derogated from the path of life that they had decided upon at a very young age, indeed at an age where they were far too young to kind of engage in the critical investigations of life's possibilities that the autonomy picture puts before one. One had decided from a very young age that he wanted to be an archaeologist. The other decided from a very young age that he wanted to be a veterinarian. And that's the path that both pursued without any derogation up to the present day. So the point that I want to make here is not that the path of the autonomous chooser that I described before is false, right? It is one way amongst many, one internal sort of path amongst many to determining how one's life will go. And insisting on the autonomous chooser as superior still fails the neutrality test, because it turns out that the kind of procedure that it puts forward is potentially contentious. Lives can go well without having embodied the kind of autonomous decision-making path that I described. So a second claim that I want to make, which I will pass over very quickly because it isn't really part of the, not something about which I feel I can say very much yet, but just an intuition that I'd be happy to hear get comments about. It's not clear that focusing on the internal aspects of autonomy, the kind of process through which one determines what one's path through life will be, is best pursued in schools. We don't have autonomy classes. The character of children will result from the ways in which all kinds of other things are taught and in which aspects of the institution are organized, and it's pretty hard to be too voluntaristic about these. In other words, even if we did think in perfectionist mode or mood that we should aim at creating autonomous choosers as opposed to Whitmanians, Proustians, Tolstoyans, etc., it's not clear to me that the tools of the school are best suited to achieving this kind of internal education, this kind of molding of the way in which different people with their different idiosyncrasies think about how to choose paths of life. Now, I think that if you followed me so far, how am I doing for time? Doing not too badly. I'll have about 5 minutes left, I think. Even if we accept that there may be different paths that can be taken internally, right, to life choices, not just the sort of autonomy road, which many liberal thinkers have privileged, there are still better and worse ways in which these paths can be followed. There are better and worse environments for these paths to be embedded in. So, for example, we could ask ourselves, of any of the people that I've described, has their espousal of different options occurred in the presence of other options, right? Have they had presented to them ranges of options that they could have followed had they chosen to, regardless of the way in which choice is manifested in their way of thinking? And are the options that have been presented to them live ones for them? In other words, could they actually have accessed them? Are they options that people could have chosen to take on if their deliberative processes, whatever they may be, had led them in that direction? So my central claim is that we should go back to the Feinbergian strategy of looking outside the individual to determine what schools can do to promote autonomy or something like it, right? This freedom to choose options, which we talked about at the very beginning of the talk. And we should do this, and schools should do this by providing options and by contributing to making these options real. So what does that mean? And I'll end with what I take this to mean for the educational aims that should be pursued by schools. So the first thing we should ask ourselves is options over what? What kinds of options are presented to children in schools? And I think there's a wide range of types of options, of ranges of options that should be presented to children that have to do with their values, both moral and political, spiritual orientations and worldviews, obviously career paths, lifestyles. Now, schools could contribute to providing options, both through curriculum and extracurriculum, but also through non-curricular aspects of the organization of school life by fostering diversity amongst the student body and diversity amongst the teaching body, so that different options are given, not just theoretical, but lived, embodied manifestations. But I think that the most important point that I want to develop in further iterations of this paper are here. What does it mean to make options real? One of the obstacles which I think schools and social institutions generally should really focus on, rather than worrying too much about the internal sort of nature of the reasoning that leads different people to making choices in different ways, one of the things that we should worry about is what are the obstacles that lie in the path of options going from being purely formal theoretical options for people to becoming real. So here are just some examples. Schools and social institutions more generally need to tackle the kinds of systemic discrimination that lead some categories of persons to believe that they are not suited for certain kinds of paths, either because of considerations of gender, class, race, what have you. They should also address the subtle and sometimes not so subtle internal biases that lead our our institutions, schools and otherwise, to privilege certain options as opposed to others, to explicitly and sometimes subliminally transmit the message that certain kinds of career paths, certain kinds of ways of life are less choice-worthy than others. They should address obstacles to the recruitment of a diverse student body and staff. And they should also address differences in social capital that make some people less able to convert knowledge, the kind of knowledge that they might gain in schools, into real opportunities because either of lack of connections or lack of awareness of institutional functioning. It's often struck me that things like just applying for educational programs, be it in Cslp or in university, requires a kind of knowledge that many people around this table probably take for granted, but which is almost of the nature of the black arts for people who are coming to university for the first time, etc. I think that one of the things that we should be doing is really grounding our theory of what schools can do to promote the freedom of pupils to take different life paths. We should be focusing it on the obstacles that of this kind and of many others that lie in the way of people being able to actually access options as opposed to seeing them as purely theoretical options. I think I'll stop there. I had another slide, but I realized that time is running short.
No, go ahead, Dr. Weinstock.
Okay. So I just have, I don't want, and this is really the last point I'll make, I don't want this to be taken as either an anti-autonomy screed. It isn't. Autonomy of the kind that is described by the authors that I've talked about is one ideal amongst many, one figure amongst many of the ways in which different people, differently situated with different idiosyncrasies, may come to decisions about how to lead their lives. Nor do I want to deny that the kinds of critical reasoning skills that are often seen by defenders of the autonomy option as crucial to education, nor do I want to deny that these should be a central part of pedagogy. The first point that I want to make is that it's unclear that the curricular elements that defenders of robust autonomy tend to emphasize, critical reasoning, etc., serve the purpose of that very specific conception of autonomy anyway. And I think that they're best understood as crucial, not so much to autonomy understood as a particular way of reasoning about one's choices, but they're critical to something else, which is very important and about which I haven't talked about at all today, but which could be the topic of another paper, namely crucial to democratic citizenship. As we are now a year from the beginning of COVID and the policy responses to COVID, I am struck at how important it is that people be taught to understand and to reason probabilistically so that they can understand the kinds of information and models that are presented to them by epidemiologists and public health officials about different policy options that are being considered or chosen. Learning about logical inference, etc. All these things seem to me to be terribly important to democratic citizenship, but they seem to me to be orthogonal to the task of promoting the kind of autonomy that has become central to a lot of the literature in philosophy of education. And that is really it. And with that, I will, should I stop sharing my screen?
You can do that if you'd like. Thank you so much. That was super interesting and super clear up to a point that we have no questions at all.
Oh.
So I would ask Dr. McDonough to perhaps ask a question. Kevin? So we have one question right now. We have another.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's give people a couple of seconds to do this. So yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. So Marina, would you like to ask your question live?
I'm reading it off the screen.
Okay, perfect. You can see it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, hi, thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I find the proposition very interesting. I think it's, I mean, I'm very sympathetic with it, but coming from the education, I know that the research shows that people going in teaching, the teacher, that the people that choose teaching as a career are very often from a very homogeneous background. Right. So they're, and especially at the primary level, they are very generally from a white middle class, like low middle class background. So I see this as a very big obstacle to what you are, the proposition you're making. How do you make this very open yeah, how do you provide options with a very homogeneous staff? That's my question.
Well, so I think that diversifying the staff is I think an imperative, and it's an imperative because I think that it's very important for pupils to be presented not just with theoretical images of what different options might look like, but with sort of embodied versions of them from different, so I think that one needs a better understanding than a philosopher could give you of what the drivers of the phenomenon that you point to are. In other words, what is it that is keeping people from perhaps other milieus than the ones that you've described to take on teaching profession? Now, it's not a secret to anyone around the table that I have been an opponent of the kinds of policies that have been put in place in Quebec by this government, which has discouraged, which I think has had a dampening effect on, a more potential diverse body of people coming into the teaching professions. But I'm struck by other aspects of it. It's probably also a very gendered profession. I think that the kind of homogeneity that you describe is probably along a number of dimensions, right? It's not just middle class; it's also middle class white, middle class maybe more women than men. So I think we need to understand what is going on here, what the drivers and the inhibitors are, and I'm sure. I know that there are studies that I'm probably not aware of, and policy needs to act on them. Policy just needs to find ways of breaking the vicious cycle of. This is a vicious cycle that we recognize everywhere. People of different classes, people, racialized minorities, etc., don't see that many people of their kind amongst the profession X, teachers or whatever, and subliminally kind of assimilate the message, well, this isn't for me. And so how do you break into that vicious cycle? That's precisely the kind of thing. Obviously, it's not just the job of individual schools to do this, but of the public education sector as a whole to both identify and break through these dynamics. But I think there's an empirical issue that needs to be resolved first. Should I just read the questions?
Yes, please, Professor Weinstock, go ahead.
I don't know whether Luis wants to. Without religious schools, could the identity of children and further adults be compromised? Yeah, so this takes us very far afield. So my view requires, in a way, that I bite this bullet, and that I say that in order for. So one thing that I would deny can other people see Luis's question, or should I read it out?
I think Angus may have asked Luis if he would like to ask it orally. If not, I'd be happy to read it out.
So the question, I'll read it out. It's right in front of me here.
Okay.
Without religious schools, could the identity of children and further adults be compromised? Should we leave religious beliefs only in the private sphere of life? Don't schools have the right to promote religious education alongside with tolerance and an ecumenic spirit? Autonomy in Kantian terms involves a rational expertise that children do not yet have to develop, and they could develop in a religious context precisely like Kant did, absolutely. On pluralist conception of autonomy, it doesn't matter the content, only the liberty to choose, and in that may all the choices are equally valid. Could that lead to a relativism and an indetermination of identity? Okay, there are a lot of questions packed into that question, and I'm only going to have time, I think, to just poke at a couple. The first thing is, I don't think that giving parents the prerogative to shape their children's religious lives limits them to the private sphere, because they also have an impact on the way in which children enter into what could broadly be understood as civil society. In other words, parents don't just embody a religious view inside the four corners of the house. They also do so by taking kids to church or to synagogue or to temple or to mosque, and by enrolling them perhaps in all kinds of other church-based activities. But the other aspect of it is I think that children have a real interest in having at least part of their lives carried out in places that are quite different from the environments in which, especially as young children, they lead the rest of their lives. If schools are going to provide, at the end of the day, the view that I'm putting forward is that children should be presented with a whole range of options. The school should be kind of a bazaar in a way, in which there are all sorts of different things going on that decenter, as it were, the child from the kind of path which quite normally parents might want to imprint on their children. So in order for that meeting both the child's interest in a sort of a margin that separates them from the influence of parents and communities, and by the way, not just religious parents. I have an article in which I run this whole argument using the example of Andre Agassi, who was raised by parents who had a monomaniacal kind of obsession with his becoming a great tennis player, and who shaped his entire education around that. I think that there's a real importance in children being given a sort of a margin to which they can sort of repair in order to be provided with a broader range of options. So I'm going to bite that bullet and say, actually, no. Okay, how does the Proustian objection really challenge the procedural autonomy if it includes revisiting conceptions of the good?
Hi, that's my question actually. So, well, thank you first of all so much for this beautifully done presentation. And you raised 4 objections, or actually 5, sorry, to the procedural autonomy. And one of the objection was the Proustian objection, such that life cannot be planned. But you also presented procedural autonomy to constitute in conceiving, reflecting, and revising a conception of the good. So the fact that something unexpected can happen in your life, which then can change the course of your life, I think is actually compatible with the procedural autonomy conception. So I was just wondering why
Yeah.
a Proustian objection really undermines the procedural autonomy view.
It's a great question, and maybe so they're not so much objections, I should say, right? The point that I want to make is that we should be pluralistic about the psychological frames of mind that lead different people to adopt the choices that they make. And I think the autonomy one is attractive, but it is not unique. Now, one of the aspects of certain framings of the autonomy perspective, which it may not be present in every single articulation of it, is the idea of a plan of life. You find this very, very clearly in Rawls, in the theory of justice, the idea of a plan, right? Again, a plan is something that you plan from this moment forward, right? Bernard Williams, the philosopher Bernard Williams, has a very beautiful essay in which he criticizes also this sort of plan of life idea. So I completely agree with you that the Proustian, as depicted in the Charles Larmore article that I cited, is a reflective person. You don't write a 2,500-page book of the inner musings of an individual without sort of acknowledging the importance of reflection in a way. Alain Michel du Temps Perdu is one of the greatest examples of deep reflection that we have in you know, in letters and philosophy, what have you. But what you don't have is a planner, right? What you don't have is someone who views it as central to their being able to view themselves as autonomous, that they have a plan of life that sort of excludes what both Williams and, in a very different way, philosopher Thomas Nagel called moral luck. But I think you're absolutely right that you know, the Proustian view does not exclude other aspects of the kind of picture that I refer to as the autonomy picture.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Daniel. I think Angus is telling me that we're getting close to time, but I thought I'd maybe end off with a question for you.
Sure.
And yeah, I mean, I may have asked a question something like this to you at some other event, and you know, in another context. But I find that as I hear you present these ideas, you know, in different contexts, I'm becoming more and more sort of persuaded that you're on the right track. But what I'm interested in is, you know, what if the school itself is the problem? In terms of specifically your proposal of, you know, that the important thing is to provide access to options, right? And Marina identified one element of schooling that I think provides a big obstacle, which is, you know, the need for a diverse teaching force. And it's fine to say, yes, we need a more diverse teaching force, but doing that is a whole other thing.
Right.
But there's also, you know, the highly kind of, you know, and somewhat narrowly academic culture of schools, which, you know, I think could block a lot of options that are important for good lives of many people who can't, you know, sort of find a good way to identify with that sort of approach. There's the connection to, you know, the sort of human capital sort of connection, you know, the career. So I mean, I'd just like to know if you thought about, you know, alternatives to the school as
Right.
a kind of policy option for realizing your proposals.
So that's a good small question to end on, and the answer is you know, I feel that I have, and so just autobiographically, my kids all went to an alternative school for their elementary school here in Montreal, and although, you know, it wasn't alternative in a kind of a wild, you know, forget about learning to read or write way, it did point forward to a vision of what can be done in sort of these congregate learning environments that is quite different from what gets done in the standard public school system. And I'd like to, in finishing this, and maybe this is something that I'll be calling on you offline to provide me with, you know, relative documents about. I absolutely agree that, you know, the picture of the school that I'm, there's a danger, there's an accusation that can be made, which I think I would be vulnerable to, which is that I'm rejecting one kind of pie in the sky ideal, you know, the autonomy forming school, for another, right? Which is a kind of you know, presenting options. You know, I present it as this kind of minimalist thing, no big deal. You know, it's a very, but in fact it is. You know, it runs against a lot of what happens in schools. So I, you know, my view is kind of has some constraints on it in terms of, for example, accepting things like homeschooling or unschooling, which is quite, you know, to put it bluntly and quickly, I think that kids have it's really important for kids to have time that they're not spending with their parents, right? And that they're spending with other kids. So I think that the idea of congregate sort of teaching environments where kids come together is an important one. But yeah, I agree that the lack of imagination that I've found in all the schools that my kids have come into contact with, except for this little alternative school where they had the very good fortune of starting their educational lives in, is fairly stunning. I could go on. I'm struck by, as for a lot of things, the pandemic is a crisis that could have been an opportunity, right? The fact that there are public health reasons to avoid certain kinds of bringing together of people might have been a door open to think all kinds of wild thoughts about what school might do, right? Outside of the doors of the school, perhaps. And I'm just struck by how meek the institution's thinking about these possibilities has been. But I think I need to do a lot more reading on like the philosophy of the school as an institution to see what realizable utopias are out there. But you're absolutely right to press me on that.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Just to sort of finish off that thought, I certainly wouldn't have wanted my question to be taken as a kind of leaning towards homeschooling as the primary option. And I think you know that, but creative alternatives to schools, or even partnerships with schools. Maybe there's something there for us and others to talk with you about going forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody who is here asking questions. The audience is a great exercise for me. I wish we were actually in each other's presence other than virtually, but it's really given me a great opportunity to start giving some formulation to these thoughts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weinstock, and to all the CSLP team members behind the scenes. And I would just like to say, to learn more about the CSLP, we invite you all to visit our website that I just added to the chat, and stay tuned for our next speaker series coming up on March 3rd with the Professor Jennifer Morton from the University of North Carolina. On behalf of the CSLP and on my behalf, I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.